In the name of the one holy and living God. Amen.
Amen.
In the fall of 2015, I took a very long ocean voyage with my husband to celebrate our 40th wedding anniversary. That voyage began in Barcelona, Spain, and ended in Istanbul, Turkey. But as part of that trip, we spent a great deal of time in the small countries that emerged out of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The most memorable of those countries was Croatia, where we journeyed inland from the Adriatic Sea to walk among the earliest ruins of the early Christian church outside of Rome, Jerusalem, and Greece. What marked that journey by sea was the high level of security in every port. That security was not because of a high-level terrorist threat. Instead, it was because of desperate Syrian refugees flooding every northern Mediterranean port looking for sanctuary after years of civil war, and the continuing threat of ISIS in every refugee camp close to Syria. I need to say that while the political landscape of Syria has changed until this week, the threat of ISIS has not. As we walked among the remarkable ruins of Christian churches and the remains of communities from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, I asked about the bishops whose names were chiseled into the stone of the churches and who had served these faith communities, sometimes as martyrs. I recognized some of the names. You don't want to know why I knew Syriac. Making Christianity a cornerstone of Croatian life. The guide replied that every bishop was a Syrian refugee from another time, another conflict, who had fled to this distant outpost of the Roman Empire, bringing to the native Croats the Christian faith. I grimaced, I couldn't help it, and I said how sad that made me, given the laws that I knew the Croatian Congress had passed to close these borders to Syrian refugees. The guide sighed and said how sad it made her, that they were refusing entry to the people whose ancestors had given them the faith that they treasured. On this first Sunday in Lent, temptation is a theme shared by all of our readings. Of the 3 temptation stories in the Gospel, Luke is far and away my favorite for its steely realism. It is the Spirit who leads Jesus into the wilderness immediately after baptism, and the devil is not far behind. It is a reminder to us of how we are tempted to go astray, how vulnerable we are when the Spirit of God calls us to a mission on behalf of God. The devil is often not far behind, intent on thwarting that mission. And like Jesus, we need to choose again and again for God. And the other note of realism comes at the conclusion of today's gospel, when bested by Jesus for the moment, the devil goes away until a more opportune time. We know that reality too. By God's grace, we conquer temptation today, only to meet it another day, another hour. Jesus' temptations are alive and well, and among us, not only personally, but in and out of the church. The late Lutheran pastor and congregational development writer Peter Steinke says that we face 4 temptations as a church, especially when we are in our own wilderness of worry about money or attendance or aging in place as congregations. These temptations are, first of all, to be relevant. Of course, we know every young person loves the music we loved as young people, right? This means acting in ways that we think will attract people, rather than seeking the Spirit of God to show us new ways of giving praise and thanks to God. Second temptation is this: we are always seeking to be more powerful, to be the church equivalent of the 800-pound gorilla in whatever it is we need to do. And the third temptation is to be spectacular. This tends to show up in programs that tend to lead the church rather than being missions and callings of Christ sent from the church. And the final temptation is the most vexing, because so often we are doing it without knowing it. It is the temptation to be self-serving. The wilderness is a place of high anxiety and self-doubt, to be sure. And looking out for ourselves only seems to come naturally. But the wilderness is also the place where we are closest to God. The wilderness is where God went with God's people. And that is why the devil is there too. After all, the devil always seems to know that God is near, as Romans says, as near as our lips and our hearts. The wilderness is not only the place to look at our darkest and most self-serving outcomes of our great capacities and gifts and callings. It is also the sanctuary where we can see our greatest hope of our calling as God's community of love and reconciliation. The Spirit leads us, like Jesus, to this dangerous place so that we can finally put away any confidence we have in what we think we can do on our own. It's never about what we can do, especially on our own. It is always and only about what Jesus discovered through prayer and contending with his temptations. It is about our faithful relationship with God and God alone. So our call this day is to give permission for God to let our faith go to work on us and in us. We are to wrestle with both our gifts and challenges alike so that we may grow in relationship with God in Jesus, who overcame it all. Our call is to build a deep and abiding relationship with those in the world who need us Monday through Saturday, and to do so as understanding these folks as more than the sum of their needs. They have real and abiding gifts that we need too. Our final call this day is to empty ourselves of all that keeps us from trusting God by constantly asking the question of ourselves: are we really doing what we want? Or are we doing the will of God? My sad learning one October day, amid the ruins of an early Christian community, is how easy it is for us only to look inward to our own survival. Rather than looking outward to what is loving, good, and just, not only for us, but for all. We are all God's children, siblings, all of us. Our triage protocol from God is to give maximum effort to those in greatest need, to trust God's promise and generosity that will not leave us forgotten when we step into the wilderness, especially when it looks like we have the most to lose.